The purpose of this video is just to acknowledge that even though I disagree, I believe that there is truth and validity in the experiences of the people who came to the conclusion that representation matters in media. Alright, so in my last video, I got super emotional about the ideal of representation and how it was contributing to the downfall of one of my favorite IPs of all time. And I basically just listed all the reasons I disagreed with this ideal in principle. But in this video, I wanted to do what I probably should have done from the beginning and try to understand why people are rallying around this ideal in the first place. Because as I mentioned in that other video, I believe that there are very valid reasons why people believe representation in media is important. And those reasons should not be discredited even if I disagree with the solutions that those reasons have produced. But in order to explore those reasons, I first feel like it's necessary to outline my own upbringing and experiencing, because I believe that the differences in my experience and those on the opposite side of this argument largely contribute to our difference of opinion. So I apologize in advance, but a lot of this video is basically just going to be me telling you about my childhood.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Alright, so from a young age, my world was already pretty multicultural, and I really didn't even realize I was black until I was in preschool. Someone had said something in class, and even though I can't remember specifically what was said, I don't really recall it being negative, just an innocent observation made by one of my preschool classmates. My mom loves telling this story because apparently I came home from school that day, looked down at my hands in bewilderment, and said, "Mom, I'm black." And my mom smiled and said, "Yeah, so am I. Now go do your homework." And that was that. That's how the earth-shattering revelation that I was black played out in my household. And I feel like this is kind of important for a key reason. My blackness wasn't stressed or emphasized. There was no significance placed on this realization from an external source. There wasn't a sit down or a talk about what this means, the benefits, the detriments, my culture, where I come from, how I might be perceived, or any of that. My mom literally hit me with the "cool story, bro." And that was that. And I think what that did for me was help me not to place any significance on this aspect of my being. I wasn't better, worse, or different because of this. I was just black. Cool. Now, moving on. Now, if I compare that experience with how so many minorities, specifically black people, describe their experiences of becoming aware of their skin color, it becomes clear that our experiences were pretty different and had wildly different implications. For a lot of people, that realization was an outright negative thing.
At primary school, I had this crush on a boy. Basically, he came and found me to my face and he said, "Why would you think I'd ever fancy a black piece of like you?" And I was like, okay, you are definitely black.
For others, that realization wasn't necessarily negative, but it was still deeply impactful, and it wasn't just kind of brushed aside like it was for me.
I was playing doctor with a bunch of kids, and this one girl, it was her turn to kiss me, and she didn't, and she sort of ran away laughing, and the other kids ran away laughing, and the thing I realized at that point that I was black and they were all white, because this was a small private school in Boston. And that was the first time I remember feeling like black was somehow separate from the norm, you know? I think I knew I was black before then, because as I say in my show, my mom would not have let me not know I was black. There would have been no way that she would have let that information slip. It's cold outside, take a jacket, and you're black.
And it's important to note that this phenomenon isn't only experienced by black people, but more so amongst people in areas where they are the minority.
I grew up in East Chinatown in Toronto, so it was made very clear that I was Guaylo from a very early. Guaylo being white ghost. Sort of, you know, I know every derogatory term for a white person in Chinese.
In 1897, W.E.B. Du Bois used the term double consciousness to describe the reality of being a black person in a predominantly white America. The term refers to a source of inward two-ness, putatively experienced by African Americans because of their racialized oppression and disvaluation in a white-dominated society. Today, it is more broadly used as a framework for understanding the position of oppressed people in an oppressive world, resulting in it being used more generally amongst marginalized groups and not only black people. Nevertheless, this double consciousness or this two-ness is something that I, at least for the time being, was spared from. Again, partially thanks to my mom's almost comical disregard for the "wait a minute, I am very different" moment that seemingly most, if not all, minorities seem to experience. And I think it would be safe to say that most black people in America aren't spared from experiencing this double consciousness like I was. I mean, there are members of my own family who weren't so lucky and were forced to reckon with their blackness from a very young age because they were literally bullied for it. But I was spared, and to the best of my knowledge, this resulted in my blackness not playing any significant role in shaping my identity, which research shows is not the norm for black people. And in every significant area of my life, from the friends that I made, to the girls that I liked, to the sports that I played, to the school that I went to, and of course to the media that I watched, read, and listened to, my being black never affected any of those things in any significant way. But there was one area where my blackness was a huge inconvenience to me, and that was in almost every situation where my family and I were traveling outside of the US. So my dad's job required him to travel to Eastern Europe almost every summer, and he would take us with him. Now, I know this would sound like a dream for almost anybody, but for me, this was a nightmare. And I dreaded these trips for two reasons. One, because I was a dumb kid who couldn't understand the significance and privilege of getting to travel the world and experience different peoples and cultures. And all I wanted to do was stay home and play soccer and video games with my friends. But more importantly, I dreaded these trips because whenever we'd go to these countries, from the moment we touched down to the moment we left, we would be intensely stared at by literally every person we came across. I mean, we're talking people stopping their meals, mid-conversation, food still on their forks, mouths agape, watching us walk down the road. Now, for some context, this was the late 90s, early 2000s, and so to be fair to these people, it's quite possible that some of them had literally never seen a black person before, at least one that wasn't on TV. I could be very wrong about that, but based on the reactions that we got, I don't think that there are many black people just waltzing around Eastern Europe right after the fall of communism. But anyway, the point is that people literally couldn't take their eyes off of us, and I couldn't stand it. All I wanted to do was stay in the hotel. I never wanted to go out and see the country or eat at any restaurants or meet any new people or anything. For me, being forced to be hyper aware of the thing that made me different was nothing but an inconvenience, and it was exhausting. And it all culminated in this ridiculous experience that we had while waiting at an airport in Croatia. So this is another story that my mom loves to tell that I don't remember too well, probably because I subconsciously suppressed the trauma. But basically, while we were waiting, a full-grown adult man literally walked up to me and touched my skin to see if it was real. Yeah, that happened. I remember that much. And when he realized that it wasn't paint, he looked at my parents completely befuddled. But what happened next is extremely important because I do believe that this played a role in shaping my mind at the time. My parents, fully understanding of how bizarre this must have been for this man, started laughing. They did the whole, yeah, no, it's real thing, and the man instantly started laughing along with them. Keep in mind that neither of us can understand each other, but here we are sharing a laugh. Well, I should say they, because while they were having a grand old time, I was standing below them, out of sight, absolutely traumatized that this random man just came up and touched me out of nowhere, confirming all my fears concerning being black in this non-black country. Nevertheless, I do think my parents' reaction left a large imprint on me. They could have flipped out, and I don't think anybody would argue that they didn't have the right to. This random adult just came up and put hands on their son. Regardless of the reason, even if it's just innocent curiosity, that is never really an okay thing to do. And they could have reacted to that and just berated this man in a language that he didn't even understand. But they didn't. Even though his actions were wildly inappropriate, his intentions were innocent. And those intentions are what my parents responded to. And I don't even think they did this consciously. I think that's just a part of who they are. And honestly, looking back, I'm just glad that this random dude's first encounter was with my parents, because if it was anyone else, things could have ended up pretty badly for him. And I don't think that would have been an appropriate resolution given that his intentions weren't evil or malicious, despite his actions being patently unacceptable. And the reason I think this is significant is because looking back, I think I subconsciously adopted their approach of responding to the intent and not necessarily the action. There were plenty of times in school when kids wanted to touch my hair, something that is today seen as a microaggression. And I would let them and even play along with them like, yeah dude, I know it's crazy, especially when I cut it short and it has this really weird texture. And I think I did that because of my parents. I think I subconsciously understood that even though this was kind of weird and a little bit awkward, they weren't really doing this to be rude. It's just that out of their 20 friends, 19 of them basically all had the same hair. And then there was me. And since they were kids, they got curious and wanted to touch it. And so I let them. There were also plenty of times when kids would inadvertently or advertently make fun of my name. And I would either laugh along or jokingly throw it back at them because I think I subconsciously understood that, yeah, compared to Michael or Joey, Thief is a pretty abnormal name. And I think seeing how my parents dealt with awkward situations that came up because of their race helped inform my actions in dealing with those situations as well. Which in turn, I think helped me make friends in situations where making an enemy was almost all but guaranteed. Now, that's all well and good, but the airport incident still only confirmed for me that I did not like traveling outside of the US, in part because of how people would react to my skin color. And it was always a relief to come back home and not have to deal with being under that microscope for another 9 months. But that just just isn't the reality for most black people in America, or most minorities for that matter. They don't get to take a 9-month break from dealing with the fact that they're a minority. Like I mentioned before, I would have to deal with some awkward moments here and there that were created because of my skin color and ethnic background. But like I said, most of the significant aspects of my life weren't constantly affected by those things. But for most minorities, their skin color directly affects those same significant areas of their lives. The schools they go to, the friends they make, the media that they watch, read, and listen to, etc. Even if they try not to pay attention to their skin color, in some way, shape, or form, they will be reminded of it. And again, in many cases, that reminder will come in a negative context. And even though there are a substantial amount of people who live this experience and don't come out of it placing any significance on their skin color or minority status, it's completely understandable that there are also a substantial amount of people who do. And it's completely understandable that they would go further and make this a key part of their identity, since not having it be a part of their identity was never really an option for them anyway. And it makes sense that they would try to take pride in it, since for most of their lives they've probably been forced to downplay or minimize these differences in order to fit in. And so I have to admit that in situations where I was forced to be hyper aware of my skin color, just like they are constantly forced to be hyper aware of theirs, I couldn't stand it. I disliked this feeling so much that I let it ruin the once-in-a-lifetime experience of traveling to some of these countries. And so even though I can relate to most minorities in that I was forced to realize that I was different, and that I've also had to deal with quote-unquote microaggressions, I really don't like that term, but it does communicate what I'm trying to express right now, and that I have experienced the exhausting reality of having to be hyper-aware of my skin color. I also have to acknowledge that I was fortunate enough to be in a position where those experiences weren't allowed to shape my identity. And this wasn't only thanks to my parents' influence. It was also my siblings, my friends, my teammates, my teachers, my coaches, etc. They all created an environment that allowed me to form an identity based on the things that I actually liked. From preschool all the way up to the end of middle school, I wasn't Fief the black kid. I was Fief the soccer player, even though I was almost always one of the only black kids in my classes and on my teams. To be historically accurate though, during this time I went by Fee and not Fief, so technically I was Fee the soccer player, but that's beside the point. Basically, I'm just trying to say that this environment allowed me to not place too much emphasis on my skin color and ethnic background, and that this environment is extremely rare for minorities, who are typically forced to constantly be aware of their skin color, whether it's from the surrounding society or even those closest to you, your parents, your teachers, your friends, etc. And it is important to note that it's not always the society that will point out your differences. In many cases, it's the people around you that will make sure that you know you're different and that you're one of them and not one of the others. Regardless, this experience can lead to people placing a lot of significance on their skin color and ethnic background. And we have to acknowledge that this makes sense. And so if you take a human being and you force them to understand that they are different and that those differences will limit their endeavors in some way, shape, or form, and then you reinforce that difference every day of their lives with no chance of them escaping the reality of being different, then it makes sense why that person might deem it valuable to have a powerful tool like media represent the thing that makes them different, so that they can be viewed and perceived in contexts that aren't typical to the ones that people generally associate with the trait that makes them different. Because it may communicate to them and to the outside audience that the thing that makes them different doesn't make them lesser, it doesn't limit or prohibit them, and that thing could actually be a source of strength. That makes complete sense. And the fact that it makes sense is something that I don't see people on my side of this argument acknowledge. Just to be clear, I do not believe in the ideal of representation for all the reasons I laid out in my last video and more. But I don't disagree with this ideal because I don't think the reasons behind it make sense. I disagree with it because I think it does more harm than good. I think it teaches people to only seek relatability in other people who look like them. I don't think that there's a specific end goal agreed upon by those who support it, just the idea that more is better. And I believe we apply this ideal hypocritically. But again, if you want to see a more in-depth explanation of my disagreements, then feel free to check out my last video. The purpose of this video is just to acknowledge that even though I disagree, I believe that there is truth and validity in the experiences of the people who came to the conclusion that representation matters in media. And I think that if we're ever going to reach any type of common understanding regarding this issue of representation that is only becoming more controversial, we will first have to acknowledge that there is validity on both sides. And so I hope that the people who advocate for more representation stop immediately assuming that those who are against it are inherently racist, sexist, homophobic, or any other dismissive term that implies exclusionary thought. And I hope that the people like myself who don't believe in the representation ideal stop immediately casting the woke, SJW, dismissive, and belittling terms on those who are for it. In the grand scheme, these methods haven't really gotten us anywhere, and I don't think that they will. Because to be fair, it's kind of hard to convince people of your point after you just insulted them. But anyway, all in all, just to reiterate, no, I do not believe in the ideal of representation, but I do not disparage the reasons of the people who do support this movement. They are real, they are valid, and they deserve to be addressed. Just not like this, in my opinion. But I think that's gonna be it for this one. If you made it this far, thank you so much for indulging me. I really should have started my discussion of this topic with this video, but like I've repeatedly said, I was just too emotional about this topic and I just needed to vent my frustrations with it. And that's why I made the other video first. I'd also wanted to cover my time in high school in this video because that's where my experiences became more in line with the typical minority experience in America. Well, at least the typical black minority experience. I was stereotyped and profiled more. Some of the comments made about my name and character couldn't just be excused as childhood innocence anymore, etc. But this video is already way too long, and I think my preschool to middle school experience explained what I needed to explain. I'll probably talk a little more about my high school experience later because I do think it also illuminates why I don't support representation today. But that'll be another video entirely. In any case, thanks again for watching. I hope this made sense, but as always, if it didn't, please feel free to let me know so that I can try to clear up any misconceptions in the comments. But with that said, I wish you all the very best going forward. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.